Welcome to the Global Peace Film Festival Lives Online Conversation 2022 Festival Edition. Please join me, Kelly Devine, the Artistic Director, and Nina Strike, the Executive Director, in conversation with John Osaki, the filmmaker for the film Not Your Model Minority, which will be playing as a part of the 20th Anniversary Global Peace Film Festival. You can find out all the information about our festival at our website, peacefilmfest.org. Our in-person events begin September 19th and end September 25th, followed immediately by a week of virtual access beginning September 26th, ending October the 2nd. Again, you can find out all the information on peacefilmfest.org. And now please join me in welcoming John Osaki to talk about his film, Not Your Model Minority. Thank you, John. Welcome back. It's fantastic to have a returning filmmaker.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm very pleased to be back.
Hi, John, and this is actually your third film with us.
Mhm.
So we're delighted and really good to see you. So let's start out. Tell us about Not Your Model Minority.
Sure. So this film really examines the origins of this narrative and how it was about really Asian Americans trying to overcome the very harsh racism that so many of the early immigrants faced in this country. Started with the Chinese in the 1800s. Then it was applied to the Japanese who came after the Chinese were excluded as part of the Chinese Exclusion Act. And so there's just this very long history of very direct and intentional oppression of Asian Americans in this country. And really the model minority myth came out of really an attempt to assimilate into this country. To be accepted, to demonstrate to American society that Asian Americans could be, in fact, productive contributing members of the society in this country. And that was, really a way forward to have doors open for more opportunities. But along the way, that narrative really got weaponized by influences in this country that really saw advantages in creating divisive narratives between communities of color to try to hold up one community as an example of how, many in the dominant power structure in this country wanted communities of color to act and conduct themselves. And this was really a direct rebuke of the civil rights movement, of the Black communities insistent on equity and inclusion. And that narrative really led to some deep harm that occurred between communities. And, even to this day, there are many false perceptions about Asian Americans, about our willingness to work with other communities, to lift up other communities. And so I think that's what this film really examines, kind of the whole historical narrative and really why it is so important to examine today, and to really unpack the issues surrounding it so that we better understand how, in many cases, Asian Americans have been used in this country. And while we have achieved some benefits as a result of that, I think overall, it has been really harmful for our communities.
And John, you touched upon this notion of a stereotype that on the surface looks positive, but isn't. And I think certainly a discussion of this may be surprising to some of the viewers who hadn't, who oftentimes we think of the word stereotype as only having a negative connotation, being some kind of insult towards people. but you really do dig into sort of insidiousness of this kind of discussion. And could you draw that out a little bit more in terms of, especially as you were in toward the end of your discussion, about the divisiveness that it ended up spreading?
Absolutely. So, as I touched upon, this really came to a head during the civil rights movement, right? And there was a tremendous amount of backlash to the protests that were taking place in this country, demands for equity, for opportunity, to really break down so many of the systemic racist structures that existed in this country. And during that whole process, Asian Americans began to be lifted up as the example that the dominant, often, in most cases, conservative power structure wanted minority or communities of color to conduct themselves. So there was even an article about how Japanese Americans had come out of their incarceration during World War II and were, making progress and not complaining, and worked hard, and really were patriotic. And so this whole narrative got created out of that. And it was really meant as a direct refute of the protests that were taking place in this country, the civil unrest that was happening, communities standing up for themselves, speaking out. And so it just, it really sowed the seeds of divisiveness. And, in part, this was very much part of an intentional agenda, because, those in power understood that if communities of color ever came together and worked together in solidarity around common issues, that would be incredibly powerful and a threat to what had been kind of the traditional ways in which power has influenced this country. And so many in those positions, frankly, did not want that to happen. And so they deployed very intentional strategies to keep communities pitted against each other, to fight for limited resources between each other, and made it very difficult for communities to come together around common issues. But there have been examples of where that's happened, and I draw on. So my day job is I run a nonprofit here in San Francisco, California, and we were created by young people who were part of the Third World Liberation Front, who led the student strikes at San Francisco State and UC Berkeley that eventually led to the ethnic studies movement across this country. And what was so powerful about that whole movement, it was Black and Asian American and Latinx and Native American students coming together around a common agenda. And it was incredibly powerful. And people took notice of that. And in fact, I always like to point out that during that time, when the student strikes were taking place and the ethnic studies movement was sweeping across the country, the governor of California happened to be Ronald Reagan. And he had a front row seat to the power of that entire movement. And so when he eventually became president, he worked very intentionally to lift up this model minority narrative, really as a way to keep communities divided, and was also doing it at a time when he was making drastic reductions in federal resources to communities of color, making massive changes to the welfare system, and really defunding so many programs that were put in place during the civil rights movement. So, it really was not by accident. It really was part of a very intentional strategy to limit resources to these communities and to really, put forward an agenda that would keep the power structure in place.
That's a very powerful way to think about this, because I think sometimes there's a tendency for people maybe who are who don't consider themselves powerful or privileged, but maybe they are, though, part of or that identity group, that when they oftentimes they can feel defensive when they hear these things. But your work, this being your third film, if I can kind of tie this back to your other work, the thing that I find so important and impactful about your work is the way in which you carefully recover history in order for us to learn together, that you use specific, authentic, aspects of the historical history of your own culture, so that you can speak to how we can all move together regardless of our cultural background. And I think that's really important for people to kind of keep in mind when we're recovering this history, that it's about moving forward.
No, absolutely. These films are done. I work in partnership with a group called Stop Repeating History. And that is exactly the goal of this group, is to make sure that we do, we tend to have very short memories in this country. We forget the mistakes, unfortunately today, there are people who want to deny much of our history in this country. And so that's why I think it's so important for myself and so many other filmmakers in this country to make sure that these stories are told and retold to new audiences, because so many young people coming up, growing up in schools are, this information is not being made available to them. So I think that's why I do this, and why so many other filmmakers are doing it as well.
Well, and if we can also touch back on, you had mentioned working for a nonprofit as part of your day job. A big part of what we do at the Global Peace Film Festival is not just simply showing films, which there is, a wonderful thing about showing films, but what we really hope is that when the lights come up and people stand up a little taller in their seats and ask, what can I do? That there are things, that models that they can take back into their own community. Some films come with calls to action or impact campaigns or educational campaigns. What have you been doing with this film, and is it tied into your previous films?
So what I've been doing with this film, as with the previous two, is really trying to encourage educators to use it, to bring it into the classroom, to make it part of standing curricula, to have, to be honest, very difficult conversations around these issues. And I think that they're not things that are talked about or taught on a regular basis, but they really are at the heart of much of the race relations and issues that we're working through right now. Obviously, this particular film has a very close tie to the anti-Asian hate that has been experienced historically, but also is being seen today. And so I think that these issues are not only relevant, but will continue to be relevant. I tell audiences all the time, especially Asian American audiences, that, Asian Americans will always be one national emergency away from being the target of hate in this country. And that is not going to change. The only question is when that comes around again, will we have friends who support us? Will we have taken the time to invest in and lift up other communities and help support their issues, so that when it's our turn to have targets on our back again, that we have those who will speak out on our behalf? And I think that's a lot of the work that needs to be done right now. And it starts in the classroom, it starts in the community, at nonprofit organizations, at conventions and film festivals, and different places where we can have these hard conversations about race and where we are right now, and really where we can go in the future, in a place where we have much more power and much more opportunity to push back against systemic racism as it continues to, work very intentionally to divide us.
That is actually such an important point point and really central to what we try to do with the festival. So tell the people watching this how they can support your work, what they can do to support your work, and also what's next for you.
Well, so what's next for me is, unfortunately, part of the reason I can't be in Florida for the festival is I'm actually working on 3 projects right now simultaneously. So it is keeping me very busy. My nonprofit, the Japanese Community Youth Council, we actually celebrated our 50th anniversary at the heart of the pandemic. So we really did not have an opportunity to celebrate it. We're going to be celebrating it later this fall. And of course, as the executive director, I am making documentary about our organization. And part of the reason I'm doing it is really is I think, important example of an organization that was brought together out of a solidarity movement. And while I'm based here in San Francisco, Japantown, we serve hundreds of Black youth, hundreds of Latinx youth, hundreds of Asian youth from every Asian ethnic community here in San Francisco. And for a long time, people thought, well, why is a group from Japantown serving all these different populations? But for us, it's very normal, right? And so I've actually been part of many conversations about solidarity and communities working together. And I always share with them, we've been doing it for decades. And so I think, through this documentary, I think we'll try to share that with other audiences. I'm also wrapping up a film on called Critical Race Theory, Fact and Fiction. And it's really about how the whole movement around critical race theory has been weaponized to create this false narrative about what it really is, and how it lumps together diversity, equity, and inclusion principles all in one ball as a way in which to really inflame parents. And it's led to teachers being fired, laws being passed in states banning critical race theory, when in fact it has nothing to do with the actual teaching of what critical race theory is. So I'm wrapping up a film on that topic. And my third project is one that won't be done till later in 2023, but it's called Making Waves, The Rise of Asian America. And it's about the outcomes and the movements of ethnic studies in Asian American communities across the country, and the types of organizations it's led to, the types of leaders and others who have really promoted understanding of our histories and understanding of our collective histories amongst communities of color. So that will be coming out, fingers crossed. We're shooting for May of 2023.
Oh, fantastic. It's great to hear you working on so many incredible projects that we are definitely going to check in with you about. And thank you again for taking the time to discuss these issues. We always learn so much when we talk with you, John. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me, and best of luck with the festival.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. And thank you to everyone who listened to the conversation today. We've been talking again with John Osaki. The name of the film is Not Your Model Minority. If you want to support this particular film, please do go to newdayfilms.com/films/Not Your Model Minority, each word separated by a hyphen, just in case you're listening. And also, John, I know Alternative Facts is also part of New Day. Are all your films on New Day?
They are, and they also all are on canopy.com.
Oh, fantastic. That is a great resource for almost anyone with a library card. So really recommend searching out John Osaki's work through Canopy or New Day Films. And again, please join us at the film festival if you can during our in-person programming beginning September 19th and ending September 25th. And check out our virtual programming starting September 26th, ending October the 2nd. Much of that programming can be enjoyed from anywhere in the United States and even in the world for our shorts program. So please do check us out at peacefilmfest.org. Thank you again, and we'll see you at the next Glow.